The Persian Gulf was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. For years, international observers had watched Iran's nuclear program expand methodically, each enrichment facility adding another layer of capability, each new centrifuge bringing the nation closer to weapons-grade material. The International Atomic Energy Agency had been tracking it all. They reported Iran had accumulated 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. Everyone understood what that meant. At 60% enrichment, the final barrier to weaponization becomes more technical than physical. One final step separates 60% from weapons-grade 90%. Iran was closing the gap deliberately, systematically, undeterred by sanctions or warnings. The American government had drawn a line. That line would be tested not through diplomatic channels or United Nations resolutions, but through military action on a scale that would reshape the entire region. On the morning of Sunday, Operation Midnight Hammer commenced. This wasn't a targeted strike against a single facility or a symbolic gesture designed to send a message. This was a comprehensive dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. American B-2 stealth bombers, flying undetected across the Arabian Peninsula, dropped bunker-busting ordnance onto the Fordow and Natanz enrichment facilities. The bombs were GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, designed to penetrate deep underground bunkers before detonating. Meanwhile, Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles struck from the Persian Gulf itself, a barrage of over 24 missiles targeting the Isfahan nuclear site. The coordination was flawless. The destruction was comprehensive. Satellite imagery in the hours after revealed facility entrances sealed under rubble, centrifuge halls flooded, uranium hexafluoride processing equipment destroyed beyond repair. Think about the scale of what just occurred. Years of Iranian nuclear development, decades of research, billions of dollars invested, tens of thousands of workers trained, were essentially erased in a single night. This was the first operational use of the GBU-57 in combat. It was the demonstration of American military capability at its most devastating and precise. And it sent a message that reverberated far beyond the Middle East. Nuclear proliferation will not be tolerated when American power can prevent it. Iran had 2 days to respond. They used every hour. Iranian military commanders authorized a comprehensive retaliatory strike. But here's what makes their response significant. They didn't attack American forces directly. They didn't launch missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln, which was operating in the Arabian Sea. They didn't assault American bases in Kuwait, Qatar, or Bahrain, though they certainly had the capability. Instead, they targeted Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. This facility had served as the command and control center for Operation Midnight Hammer. It was where American planners had coordinated the strikes. It was where targeting intelligence was processed and weapons systems were synchronized. Iran's retaliation was strategic calculation dressed as military response. The message: you struck our nuclear capability, so we strike at the nerve center of your command structure. The attack itself was substantial: multiple missile impacts, damage to infrastructure, casualties among personnel, but the true significance was the demonstration of Iranian willingness to attack American facilities directly. This wasn't the old Iran of proxy warfare and terrorism. This was a nation with sufficient military capability to conduct direct strikes against American assets. The calculation had shifted. The deterrence equation was being rewritten in real time. What happened in the aftermath matters more than people realize. The Trump administration's response wasn't immediate and overwhelming. That's important to understand because it shows military strategy at work. Instead of immediate massive retaliation, the administration chose something more sophisticated: sustained military presence combined with visible preparation for escalation. This is deterrence theory in practice. You demonstrate capability, you show willingness to use it, but you leave room for the other side to stand down without losing face completely. The USS Abraham Lincoln, which had been operating in the region independently, received reinforcements. More fighter jets arrived, F-15 fighters from the 494th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron. The same squadron that had neutralized Iranian drones returned to the region. The Vermont Air National Guard's 158th Fighter Wing deployed F-35 stealth fighters to CENTCOM. These aircraft don't just add capability, they add visibility. Everyone in Iran knew these aircraft were arriving. The message wasn't subtle, but the real signal came from the Pentagon's decision about the USS Gerald R. Ford. President Trump announced that the Ford, the newest, most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, was being diverted from the Caribbean and ordered to the Middle East. This wasn't a threat. This was a statement of intent backed by undeniable military power. The Ford carries a crew of 5,000. Its air wing includes 4 squadrons of F/A, 18 Super Hornets, 70 aircraft total, along with 1 squadron of E divided by a -18G electronic warfare fighters, another 20 aircraft. Combined with the electronics warfare capability, sensor systems, and defensive armament, a single Ford-class carrier generates more combat power than most nations maintain in their entire armed forces. When the four joined the Abraham Lincoln Theater, which would occur after several weeks of transit, the United States would have two independent carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. The implications were staggering. Two carrier groups represent approximately 2,500 potential aircraft sorties per week. That's the equivalent of sustained air operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. That's the capability to establish absolute air superiority, to protect supply lines, to conduct sustained bombing campaigns, and to defend against Iranian naval or air threats. President Trump was explicit about the message. When asked why he was sending the second carrier, he told reporters, "In case we don't make a deal, we'll need it." This wasn't veiled diplomatic language. This wasn't carefully modulated military speak. This was direct communication. We are prepared for war. We are negotiating. But if negotiation fails, we have overwhelming military force ready to deploy. Here's what makes this response remarkable. It happened while simultaneous negotiations were ongoing. American and Iranian representatives were meeting in Geneva, with Oman serving as a mediator. Diplomatic back channels were active. The administration was still pursuing a political solution to the nuclear question. But those negotiations occurred in the shadow of the most visible military mobilization in the region since the 2003 Iraq invasion. This is how great power competition actually works. You negotiate with one hand while preparing for conflict with the other. Now let's talk about what NATO's response actually was, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Most people assume NATO responded with coordinated military action. They didn't. NATO as an institution had limited capability to project power into the Middle East. Most NATO nations have their military commitments in Europe, facing Russian threats, or in the Atlantic protecting sea lanes. But individual NATO members responded in ways that were precisely calibrated. The United Kingdom increased naval presence in the Arabian Peninsula. France positioned additional naval assets in the Indian Ocean. Germany's logistics infrastructure was expanded and integrated into CENTCOM command centers. German intelligence systems were incorporated into American command networks. This wasn't NATO conducting an operation. This was NATO nations coordinating their support for American operations. The intelligence dimension was equally critical. European nations, particularly Germany with its sophisticated signals intelligence capability, were feeding real-time intelligence to American commanders. This is what allies do. They share burden. Germany couldn't project power militarily into the Persian Gulf, but Germany could provide the intelligence necessary for American forces to operate effectively. Britain could provide naval presence without committing to sustained offensive operations. What shocked the world, what the news media meant when they said NATO's response shocked everyone, was that Europe stayed unified behind American action while maintaining diplomatic channels to Iran. This is incredibly difficult to achieve. European publics have traditionally been skeptical of military action in the Middle East. European governments have historically preferred negotiation to confrontation. But the scale of Iran's response to Operation Midnight Hammer, the direct attack on Al-Udeid, the demonstrated willingness to escalate, changed calculations across Europe. NATO nations recognized that containing Iranian regional ambitions required unified response. But here's the critical detail: NATO's unity was tested in a way few realized. Iran's parliament voted to close the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for Operation Midnight Hammer. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most critical choke point for global oil supply. Approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes through that narrow passage. If Iran actually closed it, if they deployed their naval and air forces to prevent shipping, the global economic impact would be catastrophic. Oil prices would spike. Economies worldwide would contract. Supplies to nations dependent on Middle Eastern energy would be threatened. This is where deterrence gets tested at a global scale. Iran possessed sufficient naval and air capability to make an attempt at closing the strait costly for commercial shipping. They had anti-ship missiles, naval mines, fast attack craft. They could make transit through the strait extraordinarily expensive in insurance and risk. But they didn't actually attempt it. Why? Because they understood that if shipping was disrupted, NATO nations would respond to protect global commerce. Because they calculated that the cost of closing the strait exceeded any benefit. Because the visible presence of American carrier strike groups, combined with NATO commitment to regional stability, made the calculation clear. This is what deterrence actually looks like when it works. It's not missile exchanges or dramatic military victories. It's the strategic calculation that someone makes internally that says, I can do this, but the cost of doing it will exceed any benefit I gain. That calculation, repeated by Iranian leadership, meant the Strait of Hormuz remained open. The military preparations continued at Al-Udeid Air Base, the very facility that had been struck by Iranian missiles. American personnel set up mobile launching systems for advanced air defense missiles. These weren't designed to stop aircraft. These were designed to stop the ballistic and cruise missiles that Iran had demonstrated it could deploy. This was preparation against escalation. The intelligence assessments that followed Operation Midnight Hammer painted a clear picture of Iranian capability. Iran possessed Khalij-Fars anti-ship cruise missiles with 200-kilometer range. They had Shahab, 3 ballistic missiles. They commanded networks of unmanned drones. They had the tactical doctrine of swarm attacks, the coordinated launch of dozens of simultaneous weapons designed to saturate defensive systems. When analysts reviewed Iran's demonstrated capability during the Al-Udeid strike, they realized Iran had just given America a practical demonstration of its military competence. Here's the strategic reality that shaped everything that followed. Could Iran successfully attack an American aircraft carrier? Direct hit probability is low. American defensive systems are extraordinarily sophisticated. Layered radar, electronic warfare, air defense missiles, and close-in weapon systems make carrier defense incredibly robust. But what if Iran launched 50 anti-ship missiles simultaneously? Or combined cruise missiles with drone attacks and naval gunfire from fast attack craft? The question isn't whether one attack could succeed. The question is whether simultaneous multi-domain attacks could achieve saturation, the point where defense becomes mathematically impossible. This is the problem that drove the forward deployment. Two carrier groups don't just double capability. They fundamentally alter the mathematical equation of saturation attack. With 2 independent air operations centers, 2 separate defensive envelopes, 2 aircraft-carrying platforms with full air superiority fighters on constant patrol, Iran faces a problem that conventional military doctrine doesn't have a solution for. The military buildup was accelerating toward a potential confrontation. Negotiations in Geneva were ongoing but stalled. Anti-government protests within Iran had intensified, with the Iranian government responding with lethal force. Trump had publicly signaled support for the protesters. Every indicator suggested the situation was escalating rather than de-escalating. But here's what's crucial to understand. Neither side actually wanted full-scale war. Iran's retaliation for Operation Midnight Hammer had been carefully calibrated. They attacked a military facility, not civilian targets. They gave advance warning, allowing some personnel to evacuate. This follows Iran's historical pattern when they fired on American bases in Iraq following the Soleimani assassination but gave advance notice to minimize casualties. Iran demonstrated willingness to strike American military assets while signaling that they wanted to avoid all-out war. The United States, meanwhile, had struck Iranian nuclear facilities with overwhelming force but was simultaneously keeping negotiations open. The carrier deployment was being managed to show strength without triggering escalation. American officials said explicitly, the United States does not seek war. This was measured deterrence, not provocation. What made NATO's response so significant was that it reinforced this message globally. American allies weren't demanding war. They were supporting American capability to wage war if necessary. They were participating in the infrastructure that makes sustained military operations possible: logistics, intelligence, air bases, medical facilities. But they were also encouraging diplomatic solution. The real story here isn't about missiles and carriers, though those are visible. The real story is about how great powers manage escalation. You strike at capabilities you can't tolerate. You prepare an overwhelming response to retaliation. You maintain diplomatic channels. You demonstrate that you prefer negotiation but have the means and will to fight if necessary. You coordinate with allies not for joint operations but for distributed support. The world was watching to see what would happen next. Would Iran escalate further? Would American pressure force Iranian capitulation? Would negotiations somehow defuse what had become a genuine security crisis? The answers to those questions would determine whether the Persian Gulf remained a region of tense standoff or exploded into full-scale conflict. What we learned from the Operation Midnight Hammer response was that deterrence still works when backed by credible military capability and demonstrated willingness to use it. What we learned from NATO's response was that alliances matter in a multipolar world. What we learned from the summer was that the proliferation of nuclear weapons isn't inevitable. It can be stopped, though the cost in regional stability is significant. The USS Gerald R. Ford was ordered to theater. F-35s deployed. Mobile air defense systems appeared at bases throughout the region. Intelligence assets were repositioned. Negotiations continued in Geneva. Iran consolidated its response. The world watched. Sometimes history is made not by dramatic events that dominate headlines, but by the months-long accumulation of military preparations, strategic calculations, and careful management of escalation. This was one of those moments. It was summer when the world learned that military action against nuclear programs was possible. It was winter early when the world learned what the cost of that action actually was: sustained military presence, escalated regional tension, global economic risk, and the constant calculation that one miscalculation could spiral into something far larger.